Good morning and a big how are you from the west of Ireland. My name is Thérèse McIntyre and I'm coming to you from a very sunny Galway city at the moment. I will apologize for any seagulls you may hear in the background and also for the fact that there is no video with this presentation. I was having a lot of difficulty in terms of the conversion to playback. It was glitching out quite a bit with the video, so I'm hoping audio only will actually work this time. I'd like to thank the BAIS and all of its organizers for facilitating this virtual conference. I'm looking forward to seeing a lot of the papers and presentations over the next month. And it's a brilliant idea because I know myself, I probably wouldn't have been able to attend had it been the literal one. So it's a lovely idea and I'm so delighted this can all take place in spite of what we have going on around us. So today I'll be talking about No Maid in History's Pages, Betsy Gray, the female rebel hero in the Irish ballad tradition. And this is part of a much larger doctoral project that I've been working on for quite some time, and I'm hoping to actually get the first draft done during the pandemic. I'm very nearly there at this point. I'll be talking about a few different topics today in terms of the research. Firstly, the idea of separate spheres and the role of women in society and how it influenced their representations within the song tradition. Then I will look at defining the hero, developing a pattern of heroic biography that may be used to determine whether or not a particular individual may be characterized as a hero in the song tradition. And then we'll examine two versions of a song called Betsy Gray in the ballad tradition. I'll also then look at testing the pattern of heroic biography and apply the motifs to the songs in order to determine whether or not Betsy Gray may be considered a hero in the same way that men are defined as heroes. And then finally, I'll briefly look at other representations of women in the song tradition. So the first thing I would like to look at is this idea of the separate spheres. And here the image we have is from the Ladies' Land League at work at the Dublin office. And this would essentially be represented as the private sphere. You can see that the women are there and they're doing what are essentially feminine activities. They're writing letters, they're reading letters, they're looking at fabric, probably sewing as well. So this is what women were meant to do. And this would have been pre-Parnell arrest during this period of the Ladies' Land League. And then we look over then at the public sphere, what happened when women actually went out into the realm of the public. This illustration would be post-Parnell arrest. In other words, when Anna Parnell and the rest of the ladies were going out and preventing evictions. And they were doing this in their petticoats, it should be noted, where they went out with rifles and weapons of any kind to go out and save people from being evicted. And you can see in this illustration, there are three women who have come up before a judge in the docks. According to Lynn Abrams, it was during the 19th century that there occurred a decline in women's status and opportunities, which resulted in part from the failure of the French Revolution to deliver on women's rights, but was in part the product of the rise of the ideology of separate spheres, which specified that women should inhabit the sphere of the home and men in the sphere of the world. That is not to say that this differentiation between the spheres of activity were not adhered to prior to this time period, particularly in the middle and the upper class context. The general perception, however, was that the women who were involved in revolutionary movements, the 1798 rebellion, for example, were for the most part low on the social scale, and perhaps would not be bound by the same gender-restricted conventions as those above them. In a case where a woman was arrested and subsequently was tried for her involvement in revolutionary activities, the conviction was that they had acted under the influence of their menfolk, or that they had been led astray by their willful nature, further reinforcing the public perception that rebellion essentially was men's work. Also, it should be noted that women's participation in political and/or revolutionary movements was not prohibited entirely. In certain circumstances, their contributions were encouraged as long as it was instrumental to the revolutionaries' cause, with the understanding that once the aims of the particular movement or the organization had been achieved, the women would return to their designated sphere and behave in a proper, socially acceptable fashion, as wives and mothers, devoting themselves to the service of others. On the one hand, they wanted to encourage women's active participation, while on the other, they still wanted to keep women in their own sphere. And we see this particularly all the way through the 20th century. One of the most known examples of this probably is Rosie the Riveter, where when the men went to the front to fight in World War II, they left the factories, obviously, and then women were asked to go in and make munitions and build parts for airplanes, things of that nature. But when the men returned from the front, it was expected that women would actually return straight to the kitchen and all of their domestic duties and give up their work in the public sphere. And even in the 1970s, or up until the 1970s in Ireland, women who worked in the civil service were supposed to give up their work once they were married. So this is something that persisted throughout the 20th century. Amanda Vickery has forcefully argued that the separation of spheres between men and women was a constant in history and not a creation of the late 18th and early 19th century middle classes. And it is one that continued well into the 20th century, as seen in the cover illustration of a book written in 1968 about the sweethearts of the Irish period of rebellion. The artwork is a stereotypical depiction of what was perceived to be the acceptable woman's role: a sweetheart wife saying goodbye to her lover husband as he embarks upon his military crusade. The items in the lower right-hand corner are a blend of essentially male and female objects, intermingled but easily identifiable by their gender associations. The women's self-sacrificing nature is reflected in the summation of their respective lives as having lived and loved in the shadow of the gallows. And if you look at the objects in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see the pike, the sword, and the gun, which were essentially male objects, and then the locket, picture, and letter, which could be interpreted as female objects. The use of the word shadow suggests that the women, more often than not, were behind the scenes of any insurrections, awaiting word on the fate of their son, husband, father, without being afforded the opportunity to influence the events in a more direct manner. The initial impulse to tell the story of real heroines who are sometimes forgotten by the race from which they sprung is overshadowed by the description of these heroines as wives, mothers, sisters, and sweethearts, rather than warriors whose contribution to the cause was to give strength and courage and love to their menfolk, rather than bearing arms. It is in the chapter headings that the women's identities, where they are not named, are reduced to descriptions of each woman's perceived character. Wolfe Tone and his dream woman, Thomas Addis Emmet and his heroic wife, and my personal favourite, O'Donovan Rossa and his little poetess wife. The women's heroism is measured not by their contributions on the battlefield or the perilous smuggling of weapons and messages, but by their heroic devotion to their men's dream that called for sacrifice, and the performance in the most exemplary manner the duties of a daughter, wife, and mother. If, as Bartlett argues, Irish women were ignored in nationalist historiography because nationalism in the 19th century had little time for women, at least in a public role, unless, as noted previously, it was a temporary one necessitated by circumstance, O'Kelly's assessment of the feminine heroic ideal, rather than re-evaluating the previous perceptions of women's roles, only serves to reinforce the minimization of their activity during periods of military and political unrest. The preservation of the concept of separate spheres, where an ideal woman is one who performs her feminine duties in support of her male counterpart, relegates women who behaved in opposition to the realm of the forgotten. What then became of these women who conducted themselves in a seemingly more masculine fashion, and how specifically in the Irish song and ballad traditions are they represented and remembered? Now, I just want to talk briefly about what the development was in terms of the pattern of heroic biography that I use with regards to the song tradition. Now, the late Shane McIntyre characterized heroes in 5 ways. He said that they had to be young, charismatic, good-looking, intelligent, and dead. I've actually added 3 other elements to this pattern of heroic biography. Now, my initial impulse turned out to be the first brick wall that I reached in my research, because what I felt was the way to approach the development of this pattern was to look at the scholarship that had been done in the literary tradition. And there was more than 100 years of scholarship in terms of looking at how heroes are developed in the folklore tales particularly, and that tradition. It included scholars such as Nutt and Lord Raglan, Jostet, Campbell, and O'Hogan that went all the way up until the 20th century. And what I did was I took all of their patterns of heroic biography and set them out, thinking that I would be able to pull common elements out of them and then develop a pattern of my own. Unfortunately, when I did lay them all out, it turned out that there was only one characteristic that they all agreed upon, and that was that the hero died. It didn't matter what kind of death, it was just that he died. So I had to backtrack a bit and try and figure out how to come up with this pattern. So I went back to my master's thesis, which was actually about the Kevin Barry Ballad. And it is a very popular song in terms of print and recorded canon, and even in terms of contemporary transmission. It's a song that has had quite a bit of longevity since it was first composed in 1920. So I went back and looked at the song, and I pulled out the characteristics within that song that I felt defined a hero according to even literary traditions. So these are the elements that I came up with. There are 8 elements. So the first one, the hero has a cause. In other words, he has something that he's fighting for. The hero is young. The hero demonstrates courage when faced with death. There's the presence of an enemy that the hero must fight against. The hero must be brave. There's the solo status of the hero. In other words, the hero usually acts alone. He does not have somebody with him during a period of action or something that leads to his death. The hero refuses to turn informer. Now, this may be something that is actually unique to the Kevin Barry Ballad. I have yet to find it within another song at this point in terms of my own research. And then the last one, the hero dies a violent, extraordinary, or a mysterious death. So in other words, the hero ends up dying, and that solidifies his heroic status. Now, before I look at the songs, I just want to talk a bit about Betsy Gray herself. That is the only illustration we have of Betsy Gray. I haven't found any others, so you get some idea of what she looks like. Little survives to chronicle the role played by women, yet a number of ballads contain fleeting references to their courage and sacrifice. Kinsella's statement summarizes the difficulties in attempting to locate examples of the elusive female hero, not only in history, but also within the song and the ballad traditions. Although women's respective achievements during periods of rebellion were known by the general population, seldom were they recognized within the framework of history, and even less so within the songs and ballads of the time. One of the great collectors and composers, Robert Dwyer Joyce, who wrote the ballad The Boys of Wexford in 1864, claimed that a woman was among the first to join the United Irishmen of County Wexford, but in the fashion of the day, she was not named and no further information was given about her. This rather calculated neglect of female heroes demonstrates the dichotomous nature of women's involvement during periods of rebellion and political upheaval. While their behavior was, on the one hand, a necessary evil of the time, in the aftermath of events such as 1798, the agrarian movements during the Land War, and the Easter Rising of 1916, their actions were perceived as inconvenient. There was a fine line where a woman could overstep the bounds of womanhood, and the memory of those women who transgressed the socially accepted boundaries of behavior, even in extreme circumstances, were destined to become victims of the late 19th century paternalism, the focus of which was to maintain the status quo of the spheres. Betsy Gray is one of the little-known female heroes of 1798 who reached notoriety, at least on a local scale, after the serialization of her exploits, which culminated in her involvement in the Battle of Ballynahinch on 13 June 1798, were published in the North Down Herald in 1885. The subsequent book, written by W.G. Little, was compiled from the newspaper editions in 1888 and reprinted as late as 1968. It is at the end of the chapter 40 that Little introduces the reader to the Ballad of Betsy Gray. While claiming that the ballad was still familiar in thousands of homes, an assertion that may seem somewhat exaggerated even if made today, Little gives no information on the ballad itself in terms of composer, air, or from what source he received it. Subsequent songbooks, of which there are few that contain this ballad, give only scant information as to the historical relevance of Betsy's involvement in 1798. Although a variant of the ballad was published as recently as 2000 in Terry Moylan's collection, no additional information on the ballad is provided. The history of the song itself, it appears, has been lost. So now I'm going to look at just the 2 versions of the song and sing a couple of verses of them for you, just to give you some ideas to what they sound like and to get some of the words in your heads in terms of the descriptions of Betsy Gray and how she's represented. Now, neither of the songs actually has an air, so I fitted the airs to them. The first one, the Little Ballad, I'll be using the air to the Croppy Boy, and then Moylan's version, I will be using the air of the Foggy Dew for them, because I think they both respectively fit those very well. The highlighted lines in red indicate those elements that are part of the pattern of heroic biography that I'll be discussing in a few moments. As you can see with Betsy Gray, there are the little version. There are 18 verses. They are all short line verses, so four line stanzas and short lines. So I'm just going to give you a bit of a blast of a couple of verses anyway, just so you can hear these songs now. The good thing about video is you don't have to see me taking a swig of water. Then from the grassy vale she sprang, this beauteous, noble, fearless maid, and back she ran with bounding step, that she might seek to give her aid. A yeoman raised his sword to strike, as Betsy to the rescue ran. "Oh, spare my brother's life," she cried. "Oh, spare him if you be a man." So that's the first one now. And as I said, that's the Heir to the Croppy Boy. So the next one then is the Moylan version from Terry Moylan's collection, The Songs of Revolution. So I'll just give you a couple of verses of this one as well. And as you can see with this song, there are fewer stanzas, but they are longer lines. And it looks to me as if a lot of these were combined from the shorter verses of the little version and that, but I have nothing to prove that, but this is what it looks like to me. A yeoman raised his sword to strike, as Betsy to the rescue ran. "Oh, spare my brother's life," she cried. "Oh, spare him if you be a man." She raised her white and rounded arm, as if to ward the dreadful stroke. Vain was her prayer, the weapon fell, and smote her hand off as she spoke. Another of the murderous crew, a man who came from Manna Hills, laughed at the brutal deed and cried, "More rebel blood must yet be spilled." He drew a pistol from his belt and shot poor Betsy in the eye. She sank upon the heathery ground and died without a sob or sigh. So that just gives you some idea as to what those two songs might sound like. I think the two airs actually fit each version fairly well, but it'll also let you hear some of the descriptions in the songs as well and how Betsy is represented. So I'm now going to talk about just testing the model of the pattern of heroic biography. And I've just done a refresher here in terms of the 8 characteristics of the pattern I've developed. And as you can see underneath, you can see the little version and the Moylan version. And it essentially sets out how many times each characteristic appears within those versions of the songs. And as you can see, 6 and 7 are actually not included in either version of the song. So I'll talk about that in a moment. The components of the pattern that are present both in the Little Ballad and the Moylan variation, and the number of times that they appear, are as follows. Of the 8 elements of the suggested heroic pattern, Betsy Gray contains 6. Numbers 6 and 7 are the only 2 that do not appear in either variation of the ballad. The rest of the fundamentals are essentially the same as those appearing in the songs and ballads containing male heroes, although there are some additional layers added to the representation of Betsy Gray that ensures her gender will not be forgotten. For example, Betsy's cause is the same as that of any male patriot, the fatherland and the patriotic flame. However, Betsy also has a more personal cause to justify her actions, the attempted rescue of her brother George and her sweetheart Willie Boel. While songs and ballads about male heroes often mention the protagonist's comrades, the saving of them would never be allowed to outweigh the larger cause of fighting for independence. The death of one's companions in battle for the sake of the cause was accepted as a necessary sacrifice. When Betsy discovers that the two individuals whom she holds most dear are in danger, she is distracted from her initial motivation of patriotism, which is essentially male, and her involvement in the thickest of the fight, only to return to the stereotypical role of sister lover whose aim is to protect those whom she loves. While this regression does not negate Betsy's probable heroic status, it does serve as a reminder that one is dealing with a female persona. In terms of Betsy's youth, the word itself is never used, nor is her age mentioned. Yet there are numerous descriptions of Betsy's behavior that imply the semblance of a youthful personage. Betsy is described both as winsome and a maid, who from the grassy vale she sprang and ran with bounding step, all of which suggests someone of less mature years. Betsy's youthfulness, as with her male counterparts, is reflected in her somewhat naive, heat-of-the-moment reactions during the battle. An innocent belief that, perhaps because she is a woman, if she pleads for her brothers' and her sweethearts' lives, they, as well as herself, will be spared. Her inexperience on the field of battle, of which perhaps a male figure would have been more aware, did not prepare her for the cruelty of the enemy who laughed at the brutal deed. In spite of this, however, Betsy does not attempt to escape during her final moments, but continues to plead for the lives of the others, which results in the severing of her hand and a bullet in her eye that ultimately leads to her death. While the Moylan variation of the ballad does not question Betsy's heroism, it is interesting to note that the Little version poses doubts as to her bravery. Verses 3 to 6 tell of how Betsy mustered there upon that day and drew the sword for fatherland. But later on, when herself, her brother, and her sweetheart are subsequently retreating, Betsy, who becomes separated from them, quickly did she look around a quiet hiding place to find. Although Betsy immediately relinquishes the safety of her refuge upon hearing the cries of her loved ones, there are misgivings about her conduct. The fact that her friends some distance were behind implies that she may have abandoned them in battle and began the retreat before them, and it is unknown what Betsy's alternative actions may have been had she not heard that her brother and her sweetheart True had by the yeoman been found. The uncertainty about the heroism of the female protagonist is not a component of the song and ballad narratives of the male hero. Their actions seemingly are never suspect and their cause is clear. However, it may be said that in her death, Betsy dispels any apprehensions about her worth as a hero. In true male fashion, Betsy makes her departure without a sob or sigh, thereby demonstrating the stoicism with which the male hero, without exception, approaches his demise. Therefore, according to the analysis and a comparison with the proposed model of the heroic pattern, Betsy Gray meets the requirements that allow her to be categorized as a hero according to the male mold. Several of the motifs, particularly in the longer version of the ballad, are repeated numerous times, as in the songs and ballads concerning male heroes, and, with the exception of the somewhat skeptical nature over her initial actions, Betsy's overall heroic reputation is firmly established. Betsy's femininity is highlighted within the lyrics of both versions of the song. A beauteous, noble, fearless maid, with a white and rounded arm, whose hair hung o'er her shoulder and wore a gown of green. This description of Betsy's appearance within the ballad not only operates as a reminder of her true gender nature, which emerges in the gesture of sacrifice that she ultimately makes in attempting to save her comrades, but it also destabilizes her position as a true hero by calling attention to her gender, something that does not occur within the songs and ballads about male heroes. The singer or listener does not need to be reminded that individuals such as James Connolly or the Manchester Martyrs were men. Their names alone, as with Betsy Gray, confirm their gender status. Yet the composer of Betsy Gray found it necessary to include descriptions of Betsy's appearance, as well as numerous mentions of her name, so that there would be no doubt as to her gender identity. Now, just briefly at the end, I would like to discuss a few other ways in which women are represented within the song tradition, particularly seeming as there are so few ballads that would represent a woman as a purely heroic figure in the way that men are represented. If, as we all gone claims, the songs reflect women's perception of society and how women are perceived by that society, and that no song can survive which is not consistent with the contemporary outlook, it would explain to some extent why songs such as Betsy Gray only really survive in print form. At the time of its composition, the representation of the female subject would not have conformed to the prevailing opinions about the woman's role in society. This begs the question, are there other ways in which women are represented in the song and ballad tradition, and is there a prevailing pattern? The first one I've named there is Dugas's Warrior Women, and this comes from a study by Diane Dugas of what she refers to as transvestite women. In other words, women who change their clothes into men's garb in order to go on the high seas, have their adventures, become pirates and things of that nature. You don't find too many transvestite ballads in the Irish tradition. Her study mainly focuses on the English ballad tradition. Some examples of that would be The Handsome Cabin Boy, Mary Ambrey, and Annie Bonny. The second category would be the Banquincha, or the Wailing Woman. These are women who are wandering the world, perhaps dressed in black clothing, tearing their hair out, and essentially telling the world about how they have lost their lover or something horrible has happened to them. An example of this would be the Blackbird of Avondale. The opening verse of this actually indicates the man meets the woman who says her robes are changed to mourning that once were so glorious. I stood in amazement to hear her sad tale. Her heartstrings burst forth in wild accents, deploring, saying, "Where's my Blackbird of Avondale?" And then My Emmets No More would be another example of that ballad as well. The third category is the suffering woman, or the way I describe it would be a woman who acts perhaps in a heroic manner, but even in death is not allowed to rest. An example of this would be a version of Henry Joy McCracken that I sing, where his partner has actually helped Henry Joy, or attempted to help him, escape before his capture. And the final verse actually talks about her. She's died and been buried on the cave hill. And it says, "The rebel wind speaks freedom still above her weary head." So it indicates that even in death, she's not allowed to rest. Another version of that would be the Irish language song Mara Niwangan, which again is about a woman who acts against the norms of society and suffers for it. This is actually a trope that seems to have carried over right into the 21st century. A few years ago, Niamh Parsons and her sister Anne wrote a ballad called Aideen's Grave. It was for one of the Beltona projects, I believe, if I remember correctly. And it's about Aideen from the Irish folklore tradition, who went to battle with her partner and saves him. But the chorus of it struck me as quite relevant of this trope, because the chorus describes her cairn, which I believe is in County Wexford. I could be wrong about that. But it says that underneath the fallen cairn lies Aideen broken-hearted. So because of her actions in life as that of a hero, because she acted in a male manner, she is not allowed even to rest in death. So I thought it was quite interesting that even in this day and age, that sort of idea that the woman has to suffer in death still carries through. And then the final one is what I would call the countered hero. In other words, a woman behaves in a heroic manner within a song, but her actions are actually countered by another woman who performs anti-heroic actions. And an example of this would be the song General Monroe. There's a description in one of the verses that the sister of Monroe picks up the flag when the man carrying it originally drops the flag, and she's in her petticoats again, picks up the flag and carries it. But in previous verses in that song, another woman sells out General Monroe's location for a few shillings. So it's this idea that there's almost a heroic, anti-heroic perception of the women within these songs. And it can also be seen in Éamon Connick as well, but I believe more in the English language versions of it rather than the Irish language ones. So while the prototype is perhaps more successful when applied to songs where a male is the predominant subject, the shortage of historical ballads that focus on the female character complicates the assessment of the model, but does not make it any the less valid as a solid starting point. The relative indifference towards the women's changing roles within the song tradition may be reflected more authentically in the position imposed upon them by society as a whole, the reinforcement of the concept of separate spheres. And I believe this essentially has a knock-on effect in terms of the composers of the time, in that they would have been looking to compose ballads, particularly for broadsheet sellers, of popular subject matter, because something that was popular would have indicated probably a good amount of sales of ballads. So if a heroic representation of a woman was not something that was popular within society, it would have been highly doubtful that a composer would have written a song about it, because people might not have bought it at the time, because they did not want to hear about a woman who was behaving in a non-female manner. The emphasis on Betsy Gray's femininity not only underscores her unique position as a hero in its truest male form, but also the rarity of a woman being afforded the status of hero without almost certain consequences. So that's the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for listening to it. If anyone has any queries regarding the source materials that I use, I will be happy to answer any questions about that. And I look forward to getting some feedback from people as well. And thank you very much. Gurmia Malgiv.